today I've got my friend Kevin Garcia with me. Kevin, you're a digital
Hello.
pastor, you're a spiritual coach, a theologian, an author, and I remember it was not that long ago we were chatting about Bad Theology Kills, and now you've got your new book coming out. Well, I guess probably by the time that this comes out, it will already be out. But you've got a new book. I'm so excited
It's
about it. It's called
true.
"What Makes You Bloom." Cultivating a practice for connecting with your divine self. So excited to talk about spiritual practices with you. So, with all of that said, other than you being a good friend of mine, who is Kevin Garcia to Kevin Garcia?
Today I am so tired. The holidays, I need a holiday from the holiday, if you catch my drift. Um, but who am I? A bearded woman sometimes. I
Mm-hmm.
would call myself a spirituality coach these days, dog mom, author,
Oh yeah.
and like I would say that I care deeply about the human experience and people enjoying it. I care deeply about people like learning how to end their suffering. And I don't know, like I would like to think that I'm a vessel for God's love on the earth, but depending on who you talk to, I also might be the devil. So, but how I see myself as somebody who is a teacher, and I'm here to help people figure out how they're going to get I'm here to teach people how to have a relationship with the thing we call God.
Mm. Oh, you sound like a
Audacious, right?
pastor. Good
Isn't
old
that annoying?
Christian Kevin coming back out.
I
Love
know.
to see it.
That you assume that that's the Christian God I want you to be in a relationship with. So,
Yeah, that reminds me. You know how like Christian apologists like they'll make all these arguments for like the proof of God, whether it's like philosophical proof or scientific proof
mhm.
or whatever. But isn't it funny that they just always assume that it's just the Christian God? Like what if they
Yeah.
did end up finding out that God exists maybe philosophically or scientifically and it happens to be like a Hindu god or something? Wouldn't that
Yeah,
be
it's
hilarious?
actually it's Krishna, it's Brahman. It's, Brahman, Vishnu, Shiva, which is the Trinity within. Here's the thing about me, like what's so annoying about being like a woo woo slash like someone with like who has a theology degree is that like I unfortunately see the common signs of good religion throughout all the different threads. So like we got one trinity in Christianity. In Hinduism, in yoga, they got a female trinity. They have got like an in between, like a non-binary trinity. They've got a male trinity. They got it like, and within those trinities there are trinities. Like it's just the most beautiful way of understanding the multifaceted faces of God. And, why pick one, right?
That's right. It's like, you get to pick them all. It's like the
Yeah, and like that
capitalism of God. I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
it's one of those really interesting things where it's like now that I don't know, I just don't like it. People call some you would call me a Christian maybe, but I look at myself and I'm just like I don't even know what that means. Like I know that some people can say, well, a Christian is XYZ things, and I'm like, if that's your working definition, great. But like if I am a Christian, I'm not just a Christian. Like that's my caveat if people identify me that way.
I love
Does that
it.
make sense?
That's right. So it's not like you're like Christian husband, father in that order,
Mhm.
or
Right.
Christian husband, father, Republican in that order.
Right. I'm Proverbs 31 woman,
In
Christian
that order.
yoga instructor or something like that.
In that order. Kevin, you've obviously written before, you've written a book. What did you learn about yourself in writing this book that maybe you didn't know about yourself before? Obviously, you're a person that
Mm,
is constantly discovering new things about yourself. So I would imagine the book writing process is something that, a practice, if you will, that
in
helps
some
you
ways.
discover a little nugget, a new nugget about yourself.
I think what I discovered through writing this book was, we're like, because a lot of people are out talking about babies in bathwater, it's like, what are the good parts of my religion of origin or faith tradition of origin? What's still usable? And I think that's what this process of not in some ways systematizing what I do and how I teach. I realized that there is so much that I was learning growing up that was like truer than true.
Mm.
Like, it was like there's certain pieces from, they taught me that God was love and I believed them. You know, there's stories from the Bible that I look at now and I see them and I use them in like my own life because it's helpful. Like, for example, like the entire book is actually the teaching tool I'm using is the fruit of the spirit.
Mm.
Because I think that love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control are actually pretty good virtues to try to cultivate.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't believe that it's something that's just instantaneous. Oh, I'm a Christian now. I've got love. It's like, no, I've got peace. No. Joy. No. Those things are fruits, which means that sometimes they're seasonal and they have to take time to be cultivated.
Mm.
So like, it's kind of like, asking to evaluate how's your life going? You feel like shit? You feeling sad? You feeling bad all the time? What's your practice like? Your life is a latent um data point. Your current life is a latent data point about your practice. And so I think what I learned is that there's so much good that is that was still that I was handed, so many yummy things that were handed right to me, and then I just actually started using them.
Mm.
Um, so it was like, annoyingly enough, like, I think I learned that I'm probably going to be in proximity to Jesus people my whole life, which is fucking annoying in some ways because they think that they have a monopoly on him.
Hey, I saw you singing to Reliant K not that long ago.
Oh my god, through and through. Like, I will gladly admit that I'm like, recovering church kid, but that show was awesome. Like, I cried. I was a 33, no, I was 34. I just turned 34. 34-year-old human just sobbing on the front row at the Furnace Fest. Um, but yeah, I think the thing I learned about this is that there's things from the religion of my origin and my upbringing that are so helpful and so good, and you just have to, uncouple them or decouple them from the bullshit white supremacist theology that we were handed.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's one of the biggest things I wish people would understand is that you have to uncouple your idea of God from what the church has handed us. And I mean Big C church. That
Mm-hmm.
God is not a Christian, you know. God is not a
Mm-hmm.
white man in the sky who's ready to punish you. And Jesus is not some jilted lover who's also your father in heaven, but also your brother, but also your Lord. Like, Jesus for me has become teacher and friend. And
Mm.
that, I think, has been one of the greatest gifts of the journey thus far, is moving Jesus out of the position of having to be the savior of my soul into the person who becomes the gate to God,
Mm.
the path to life.
Mm-hmm.
So much better than having him having to be the bride of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of pressure.
Well, I could see you wanting to be maybe a bride at least once.
When I tell you, like, I was gender bending before I even knew what that was, because was like, oh yes, I am the bride of Christ, which means I need to. Okay, yes, this makes sense. And so I was developing a romantic relationship with a Jesus in my head, which in some ways is like a beautiful kind of devotion, um, but also a little weird.
It's like, say no more, Paul. I will gladly be the bride if that's what you wanted me to be.
Listen, absolutely. I was trying to be biblical. Still am.
Look at that. Look at you. I do want to talk a little bit later about the way that, talking a little bit more in depth about having that faith of origin that in a lot of cases has caused a lot of harm for a lot of people, both personally and obviously like
Mhm.
systemically. But how to like sort of recover those bits and pieces that seem to actually be good. I want to talk
Mhm.
about that a little later on. But before we get to that, another question: what did you learn about spiritual practices as you wrote this book? I know obviously this book's a
Mm.
little bit more kind of memoirish, but I would imagine there's like some level of research around like spiritual practices when you're writing a book like this. So was there anything that you learned about spiritual practices that you didn't know
Yeah.
before?
I mean, I'd say the book is like part memoir, but also part guidebook, because I'm telling people like the step, like, this is how I do it. Like, this is how you like begin to change your mind around things. Tell me the question one more time. I'm so sorry. Before
Yeah,
I,
what are spiritual practices, or what's something about spiritual
mm.
practices that you didn't know before?
um, that I didn't know before I wrote the book.
And maybe
Uh,
maybe there isn't anything like that. That's fine too.
yeah, I think this book was like the culmination of all the research that I had done, like that I've been doing since I started doing my stuff. So I think it was I think what I didn't know how to do well, maybe like when I wrote the last book, Bad Theology Kills, which was just like the examination of all the bad Christian theology that was killing us. I think what I realized is that um, multiple religious belonging, which is a term that I borrow from the field of practical theology, where I got my degree. Um, I didn't realize that multiple religious belonging was actually it's I think it actually there's so many more people who experience this and just don't know how to call it that, where we are
Yep.
finding our religious language not just from our religion of origin, but in these traditions that were being introduced to through the proliferation of information, through the proliferation of like having access to things like who were my people, including white people, who were my people before colonization, who were we before the empire, who were we before the church, and then also asking the question like who are you without the church, who are you without Christianity? You still good? You still a good person? You
Mm.
still loving? You still kind? Well, that's if not, then like I don't know. Doesn't seem. I think that was like the biggest part was like I really had to embrace the fact that like I'm all of it. I I have Christian language and I'm also a full-blown yogi who reads the Gita and engages with it.
Mm.
Who reads the Quran, who reads, textbooks by witches, um, and sees and finds God in all of it.
Mm.
I think the ability to be able to like recognize God in all of these paths, and not only recognize God, but to appreciate and attend to God within these different pathways. Um, I don't know. A lot of people, I think, like I think some people like when we lose our religion of origin, like we start adopting new things and it feels phony for a long time, or maybe for a while. But I think that there in persistence, there is such beauty. There's such payoff
Mm-hmm.
because in the end, like I don't know, I have my relationship with God again. I have my
Mm-hmm.
relationship with my truest self. I have a pathway to dealing with my suffering and being happy, you
Mm.
know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that so many folks are kind of, I don't know, we're all a little like multiple religious belonging. We're all like we're not just one thing. And I think that so many people are stuck on trying to be one thing that it causes us to be stifled for
Mm-hmm.
longer than we need to be, rather than
Mm-hmm.
expanding into the plethora of things we already are.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Uh,
does that make
Kevin, are
sense?
you? Absolutely. Are you familiar with John Thetominal? Is that a name that rings a bell at all?
Nope. John
So he's a
Thetominal,
theologian at Union
a
Seminary in New
process
York.
theologian.
He's sort of processy. I don't know if he would describe himself as a process theologian, but he certainly flirts with those people. Let's put it that way.
Same,
But
same
he
though.
wrote a book called Circling the Elephant that I think you would really love. And he really dives into multi religious belonging, but specifically, like, how should we think about this theologically? I think he sort of makes a more like constructive theological approach to that, to the question of multi religious belonging. Very, very fascinating. Highly recommend. I did an episode with him a couple years ago. Highly recommend checking that out if you're interested. I think
Drop
the
it in the
title of the
show
episode is
notes.
something. Yeah, exactly. Uh, I think the episode's something about like can you be Christian and a Buddhist or something like that. But John
Hmm.
Thetominal, really recommend his work. He's really great. But he is a to me a very helpful theologian to think through those kind of questions.
So good.
So, um, I kind of want to get back to that the point that I made around like having that faith of origin and navigating both the shitty parts of it, the good parts of it, and how to, navigate that part. Because obviously, this book I think is really designed or written for people who very likely probably have some sort of religious trauma or grew up in like a
Oh yeah, I'm
particular
assuming
kind of
people who
religious
pick up this book have
environment.
religious trauma.
Right. So, for many of those of us who grew up in like a conservative kind of Christianity, we had a lot of practices that grounded us. You know, there's prayer, there's worship,
Mhm,
with singing, and there's sometimes in some of those circles, it's like communion is a really big part of that. So, anyway, there's
mhm,
obviously these practices in in that world that grounded us and meant a lot to probably a lot of us growing up. But then obviously we process through things a little bit more. We realize we've got trauma around that religious environment. And so for some of us, we kind of pull away. And sometimes for a lot of us, that means we pull away from some of those practices that once grounded us.
mhm,
What is it about practice just in general? Not necessarily the conservative Christian kind of practices, but what is
mhm,
it about practices in general that connect us to ourselves and others? I think that's a good starting point before we
mhm,
dive a little bit more into that question around like how to navigate the
mhm,
the different practices that we may have once grown up with and how we should navigate those now and all of that. But yeah, what is it
mhm.
about practice just in general that connects us to ourselves and others?
I think it is when I say practice, specifically, what I'm talking about is the things that we're doing every day to reconnect ourself, small s self, to our higher self or God, capital S
Mm.
self, divine self. Um, and in general,
Can you say can you like differentiate that small self versus like capital
mm,
S self?
sure,
What's the difference between those? Because I would imagine some people might have like questions around like what does that
yeah,
even mean to have like a true self or a divine self, and how
yeah.
does that
I
differ
mean,
from like this other self?
one must understand that in any spirituality, what we're doing is creating poetic approximation for what we're trying to say. So even when I say divine self, quote unquote divine self, it doesn't quite nail it because we're talking about something that's ineffable,
Right.
something that is, we're talking about God here, right? Something
Mm-hmm.
that's, beyond being and non being, meaning and non meaning, here or there or nowhere. Um, so when I say divine self, I mean in yoga we call it the Atman, which is like the soul, which is like they mean it's the divine deposit of God, the creative force that is powering the whole universe, the thing that's making you go and continually be animated, the thing that causes you to be in like, that when you've hit the peace that passes understanding or a moment of just awe and inspiration, when you feel really, really good, when you are having a moment of incredible joy and you appreciate it. That's when I think we touch what I say, the divine self, the God self, the true self, the part of us that knows and yet never says anything.
Mm.
The part of us that speaks only through our silence and through our waiting. That's what I talk about. So when I'm talking about connecting with the divine self, I mean, what are you doing every day to get in touch with source? Another word for it, source. Another word for it, peace. Another word for it, God. Another word for it, grace. What are you
Mm.
doing every day to connect with grace, the power, the love of grace? Um, and most of us who live in, Western Christianity and capitalism have a distinct mind body split,
Mm.
because we've been taught that you can't trust your mind or your heart, and your body is a piece of sinful shit. And so your whole goal here is to continue to layer virtue upon yourself in order to make yourself good enough for God. The opposite is what I actually um, lean into more, which is you are good from the jump. You are very holy. You are a part of God's mind. And there's nothing your holiness cannot do. There's nothing that your holiness cannot heal. Your holiness is who you are at your very core without even doing anything, without even trying. It
Mm.
just is. Um, and so, what we do through practice is remind ourselves of that truth, is remember what it feels like to be in a state of ease, in a state of non pushing, in a state of receiving and being in the flow of love rather than thinking I have to work myself up into a tizzy every Sunday by dancing around on the front row and, making sure that God sees me and getting emotional in front of people because I haven't had an emotional release all week and this is the one place I can do it.
Mm.
Rather than, creating a codependent spirituality, which is what most of us have, we have to become spiritually independent people so that we can actually begin enjoying one another rather than looking to one another to fix us. You don't need to be fixed, first of all. There's nothing wrong with you. You just are growing up in late capitalism with a bunch of assholes. um, and so when I say practice, I'm meaning why it's important. Why does it ground us? Because when you sit for even a minute and you just focus on your breath, meaning the mechanism that's causing you to draw in the breath and the mechanism that causes you to exhale, and you just do that for even a minute. Thich Nhat Hanh, God rest his soul, said that when you are concentrating on your breath, your mind and body become the same thing.
Mm.
And how often is that the case? And the reason we have to give our mind something to focus on is because when we become still, the choppy waters that are running below the surface, all of the thoughts that are running just below the surface, all of the anxiety that's running just below the surface is finally able to be acknowledged and seen. And it is uncomfortable for most of us. So what do?
Mm.
We numb. Pull up the phone. It's why you grab your phone however many times a day. No shade. I do it at least 60. That's what my thing says. Um, but it's beginning to notice. It's getting in touch because at the end of the day, this is not about being good. This is about feeling better. Because so many of us are walking around with low-key existential dread. So many of us are walking around with low-grade depression, thinking that just to suffer through life is normal. And I'm here to tell you that there is great love for you. And
Mm.
there is a way to experience it in your person. And once you experience it in your person, you can experience it in the rest of your life.
Mm. The way you're describing this, and this might be feel like a little left
Bring it.
field, but you're talking about these practices as sort of like coming back to what you are, that you're sort
Hmm.
of, maybe, I don't know if you want to say like original form or your origin or whatever it
Yes.
might be, but you're coming back to where you came, right, in some way,
Hmm.
shape, or form, or what you are. You're coming back to what you are.
Yeah.
and
Be exactly who the fuck you are.
and a lot of people probably this might be a triggering word for a lot of people, but
Say it.
the original word for repentance, the original meaning for it,
Mm.
is turning
Yes.
back,
Is
right?
to
And
change your
so,
mind. Turn
right? And so
around, Barbara.
you're just turning around. And when you turn around, right, you just go back to where you were,
Hmm.
where you are, right? And so it's really interesting how, like, repentance is really similar to kind of what you're describing, even though obviously lots of people have a lot of trauma probably
Hmm.
around that word.
No, but that's really
But
the
with
thing.
that
If you
said,
could,
that is what reminds me of the way you're talking about spiritual practices, is it's kind of this repentance. It's this turning back around and
hmm,
going back to either your true self or where you came from or where
hmm,
you are, but it's this turning back around to that.
yeah, turn back to love. When people say turn back to God, that's what I'm hearing. Turn back to love. I'm like, yes. Tell me that all the time. Tell me to, because oftentimes, like, what I think and what I hold to be very true for myself is that peace is the default should be the default in our experience. For so many, it's not the default. But that's because we've been operating in a way that's not conducive. And so, like you said, we have to repent. We have to change our mind. Metanoia, baby. We
Mm-hmm.
got like, and when you can change your mind, we can turn around. Because like if you're looking and you're going in one direction for so long and you're told that's the only way to go, you know, that's like you're basically asking someone to turn around and, but I've been going this way for so long, so many years on this specific path. And but then the question is like, well, where did it get you? What did it give you?
Mm.
But anxiety. What did it give you but low self-esteem? What did it give you but like complex PTSD? Turn around, go the other direction, go towards the thing that is causing you to come alive and stop making excuses for all the bad things. That's the thing. So many of us, oh, imperfect people. Well, fuck, no shit, Sherlock. Of course it's imperfect people. But you can't just if someone's hitting you and you have the power to say, stop hitting me, and then move yourself away from the person who's continually hitting you, why then would you stay there unless you thought that you had to because you thought on some level you deserved it?
Mm.
Suffering is part of life, yes, but undue suffering can be escaped. And from where I'm sitting, I think that's part of the point of a good spiritual practice.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like
Mm-hmm.
suffering. And if I don't have to do it, I don't want to do it. And that's what I think spiritual practice does. Is it's Earthseed by the one of the verses from Earthseed by Octavia Butler says, "Kindness eases change." Every day, my practice is a practice of kindness because I've been taught for so long to be mean to myself.
Mm,
I've been taught for so long that I'm just a sinner saved by grace, rather than thinking of myself as part of God's plan, part of
mhm,
God's creative process on the earth.
mhm,
Like, that's a much more interesting and more fun thought to me than I'm a bad sinner who just needs to pray and read my Bible and go to
mhm.
church.
The way you're talking about these practices and even the sort of purpose of them, and why you do that, or why you do them, it sounds similar to like therapy. And what a
Mhm.
therapist would tell you, usually when you go to a therapy appointment and then you're finished up, they give you some practices or some things to do.
Some
And
homework.
the way that they talk about like this is why you should do therapy, yada yada yada, it sounds similar, but it's obviously not the same as
Mhm.
spiritual practices. And I know, I know you're in therapy and that you're also doing these spiritual practices. How do you understand the distinction between the two, even though obviously there's a lot of
Mhm.
overlap? How do you understand the differences between the two and why those differences matter
Mhm.
between, like I don't you don't seem to be the kind of person that would want to conflate, oh, what you're doing at therapy is the same exact thing as spiritual practices
Mm-mm.
or practice or whatever. There does seem to be a distinction that you're
Right.
attempting to make, or at least
I wouldn't even say
implying.
like a
And
distinction. I think that
so,
they complement each other quite well and that
but they're
they
not the
just
same either, right?
no, they serve different purposes.
Yeah. So can you
Um,
talk about what are those two different purposes then that
right.
they're both serving? Because that to me seems to be really
Mhm.
important, because what you're
I
what it
got
does
you.
seem to be is that you're not just saying like obviously like people should go to therapy, but like this book is not therapy. Like these are not therapeutic practices. You're not trying to label yourself as like a therapist or
I
whatever,
am no, I'm
even though
not a
they might
therapist.
people might experience them very
Yeah.
similarly, but
You might
obviously there
experience
seems to be
some
two different
therapeutic
purposes.
properties,
So anyway, I'm curious
but
what that
like
is. What are those two different purposes between therapy and these spiritual practices?
I think therapy is the place where you have somebody hold up a mirror to where you like to quote Rumi, to hold up a mirror to where you are bravely working. To
Mm,
say, okay, so this is what's going on right now. This is like your therapist is there to say, this is what I'm seeing in your pattern of behaviors. Do you see that? And just basically to begin seeing, chipping, pulling off some of like your virtue armor, if you will, pulling off some of like the outer crusty things to get at the real you. And they're like, do you see? There you are. And therapy is a place for me, especially. Um, funny enough, I have a hard time feeling my hard emotions. I have a hard time um, with my anger. And like I'm probably one of the angriest people I know, which is why I need my therapist to process these things. Um, Therapy for me, and I think for a lot of people, is the beginning place to start learning and trying on the ideas that maybe what happened to me wasn't okay. And maybe it's also possible for me to live beyond that. Um, I think and at the same time, therapy is typically once a week, maybe, if you can afford it, if you can even get in
mhm,
there. Because therapy it's access based. And so at this, as much as I want everyone to go to therapy, I know that not everyone can go. And
mhm,
so, and I would say at the same time, like, like a therapist is good, but if you aren't taking what your therapist is saying to you and taking them fucking seriously, because so many of us, it's the same thing that happens on a Sunday at church. I go to church, I get riled up, and I live off of the faith of this charismatic person standing on the stage telling me about their faith journey. Yeah, I feel the feels. And so my spirituality becomes codependent. My spirituality becomes um what's the word I'm looking for? It's conditional. My
mm,
spiritual, like me feeling good is conditional on me being part of this church space. And the same thing goes, we leave those spaces. I'm going to my therapist and they're hoping that they're going to fix me. They're going to give me the word. They're going to actually tell me how to do it. And so many times a therapist, a good therapist, is going to tell you, hey, like this is good, but you got to like, it's an everyday thing. You got like you can't just come in here and say, I love myself unconditionally. You got to say that shit every day. You can't just like, look at your wild thoughts in therapy and not be examining them outside. This practice that I am sharing and giving people, what I'm trying to say is this is how you take all the good shit that your therapist is saying and actually embody it in your everyday life. Because for me, I'm just like, I don't want to be in therapy forever, I don't want to be in a state of crisis for forever. I want to recover a sense of well-being. And that is actually what I think the point of spiritual practice is to connect with a part of you that is well, that
Mm,
is wellness itself, that is the sense of joy, peace, etc., 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 is right there. We
mhm,
can touch it. And a lot of people don't know that.
mhm. I
Um,
think there's something unsaid in your book, but is said. It's still said,
mhm.
but you don't obviously say this explicitly. And I think it's actually a theological claim, and I'd love to kind of
Bring it.
dive a little deeper in this. And that is, again, this is a book about spiritual practices. The word spiritual has spirit in it,
Hmm.
and you've talked a little bit before about like whether you call it God or source or grace or whatever you want to call it. Clearly, there's some sort of a divine element. Even, I mean, you even got the
Sure.
word divine in the subtitle.
Hmm.
It seems as if the theological claim that isn't made explicit in the book, but seems to be there, at least from my interpretation, is that there is a breaking down of the binary of atheism and theism.
Very good.
You're really opening up this definition of God or source or universe or however you want to say it. And at the same time, you are certainly not like this sort of like fundamentalist atheist that's like knows for certain God does not exist kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
So it seems as you're really trying to break down some of um, these preconceived notions that we have about God, whether you're a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist atheist.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious how you think through that theologically when you're talking about spirit and having this really open
Hmm.
sort of definition or understanding of God. Um, because it seems like you're trying to break down, obviously, the fundamentalist Christian understanding of God or spirit in this book
Hmm.
and divine, and also you're breaking down the fundamentalist atheist understanding of God, spirit,
Right.
divine in this book as well. So I'm curious, like, how you think through that because whether you put a lot of thought into that or not, that seems to be
Hmm.
there in this book.
I would have to say that's a beautiful and astute observation, and that's exactly how I feel. Is like I feel very at home, just like staunchly floating through it, because you know science tells us a bunch of wonderful things about the nature of the universe and being, and even they don't know. Like that's the thing is like they're
Hmm.
trying to like figure out what's going on in like the recesses and the dark parts of space, and also saying, well, like the universe is going outward, but also it might be contracting also, but also space might just double back down on itself or something. Like, they don't know.
Hmm.
They don't know. And that don't know, that's where I want to live. Not
Hmm.
saying that there it is, that's God. I'm just like, but it's mystery. It's the great of just like, I want to know. And the pursuit of that knowledge, I think, is also the pursuit of God. I think that trying to understand nature is trying to like is an attempt at union in some way. Um, and I think that's beautiful. In yoga, they talk about like the different kinds of yoga, where it's like there's the yoga of the mind, where you're just sitting and thinking, and through that, you're able to attain enlightenment. There's karma yoga, which is like how you do and conduct your everyday life. You do it without attachment to the fruits of it, and therefore you find God through that. There is bhakti yoga, which is they say the yoga of love or devotion, which is I would consider myself a bhakti, where it's like I find the emotional sweetness of being in awe of creation, and what I would say being in awe of God, loving all of it. I was talking on I don't know if they've renamed it yet. It used to be called the Christian and the Atheist podcast. A atheist young woman and a now she's a UU now, a Unitarian Universalist now. Um, but my atheist friend on there was describing how she was having a wonderful experience with her family at the Grand Canyon and how she was in awe of the beauty of it all. And I said, that moment of awe is what I call God. And she said, and I would just call that a wonderful experience. And I'm just like, sweet. Like that's it. There's no more fighting anymore. Just because
Mhm.
we like at this point, like a lot of us are arguing about semantics. And I don't care what you call it. I just care that you experience it. Some people
Mhm.
call it freedom. Some people call it liberation. Some people call it love.
Mhm.
And that again, like it really doesn't. I can't make a claim. I was like, I can't say whether God exists or not. I think the thing I call God does that word doesn't even scratch the surface. It's like Pete Holmes jokes in part of his stand-up, just like my God is uh, a possible thing, but not thing in the universe, which is holding it all together, but also is beyond all categories of being and non-being, here and now. But just like that's a mouthful. And so I just call it grace. And just like, when like, I would say to somebody, isn't it insane that the earth just stays on its axis and we just happen the we just have like, isn't that wild?
Mhm.
And that's grace term for me. And if people don't find quote unquote God there and they just see some like, great. That does not matter to me. I'm having a good time on my own because again, my spirituality and my connection to this feeling is not dependent upon anybody.
Mhm.
And so like I think that's where real freedom comes is when you really know who you are, when you really feel grounded in yourself, nothing shakes you anymore. I can even go home and like my whole family can say, "Hey Kevin, do you want to go to our conservative megachurch for Christmas?" And I can be like, "No, thanks." And not sweat it anymore. I can have somebody like fully like verbally accost me for having painted nails in public, which happened in Colorado Springs. um but it doesn't shock me or faze me anymore because I know who I am.
Mm.
Because I'm not like, it's not dependent upon anything or anybody except for the consistency that I keep.
Mhm.
That's it. And that again, that consistency is not to make me holy. It's to remind me that I can be if I want to be, that I
Mhm.
am, that it is who I am. It can't be stripped.
You have already mentioned a few different spiritual practices that you engage in, obviously. Yoga
Hmm.
being probably one of the more predominant ones in your life. I
Sure.
know you got your rosary beads, and so I know you're
My
doing the rosary every
mala
now and
is a
then.
mala.
A mala.
It's
Uh,
different.
it's a little different. So what are some spiritual practices that let's say there's somebody who has had religious trauma, they maybe are wanting to leave Christianity,
Hmm.
or have maybe for some time, but they're wanting to reconnect with some spiritual practices that they practice daily.
Hmm.
What are some of the sort of I don't know how to say, maybe beginner ones, if you will,
Hmm.
that you would maybe recommend? Hey, you should start out with this if this is something that you want to engage with. Yeah. What are some of the really basic ones that you would suggest?
Not to toot my own horn, but I have a zillion meditations in a library that you can have access to. It's on my website. But starting there, and I'll tell people just like give yourself just 1 minute. If you can meditate every day for just 1 minute for 7 days, start there. And I seriously mean just sit there for a minute and just breathe. Set a timer on your phone. That's it. In fact, I would even say that if you are somebody who has historically given up on spiritual practice, commit to 1 minute and just be really fierce about that 1 minute. And also, do not do more than one. That sounds it's like, well, that's it. You just want to do 1 minute? Yes. I just want you to do 1 minute. Because if you can handle that, great. Then you can handle 2 minutes and then do it for 2 minutes. And then if that feels really good, you should double it. Do it for 4 minutes. And if that feels really good, double it again. Do it for 8 minutes or five. Just slowly every day. I did a class where we did 21 days and we meditated for 1 minute and then 2 minutes and 3 minutes. And we just upped it by a minute every day up to 20 minutes. And it is that simple. You can really easily build a habit. Um, Two, find texts that are inspiring to you. And I do not mean try to reclaim the Bible, because if the Bible is a hot button issue for you, put it the fuck down for a while. Go pick up the Essential Rumi, translated by Coleman Barks. Again, the title is The Essential Rumi. Read a poem of Rumi a day and just read it. It's so beautiful. Get wrapped up in some. It's mushy and delicious and romantic and yummy. Rumi is somebody who knew God. So go hang out with him. 3, move your body in a way that feels good to you according to your own ability level. Um, because a lot of times, like, we don't love the body. Like, I'm so fucking serious. We are so numb. We don't think of our body as us or as a person. We think of it as a machine that is meant to be used to we're supposed to overcome the body in order to come to God. That's what we do in the West. In the East, it's like, I have to overcome my ego to come to God. And the answer is actually no. They need to become one thing. That's how you find God. That's how you find love. So, you know, just like read, pray, and go to church, read your Bible, pray, and go to church, read something inspiring, meditate a little bit every single day. 5 minutes is really, really good. 10 minutes is better. 20 minutes is really, I think if you are someone who considers yourself a spiritual seeker, 20 minutes it's really nice because sometimes the 5 minutes, like, I'm distracted. But by the time I get into 20 minutes, my mind is calmed down enough that I finally come back to myself.
Mm,
And I promise you, 5 minutes a day can change your life. 20 minutes will change multiple lifetimes, I think.
mm,
Um, and then read things that are inspiring to you. And also I would say gather with people who feel like family. I'm not saying it has to be a spiritual thing. I'm saying go find some friends, get a fucking hobby. Like, start a book club, go knitting, go karaokeing, do something with people that feels really, really good. Because my God, like, we don't know. It's a lot of times like, again, we leave church and like it turns out my entire personality was being a worship leader for a while. You got to go find out who the hell you are. What do
mhm,
you like? And if you don't know what you like, start with what would be fun. If you don't know what would be fun, start with what would feel good. Um, but those are the basics. And if you really want to get like weird with it, read something, meditate, and then journal. And it's like, well, that sounds a lot like quiet time. Well, you know what? It's a good fucking model. Sorry, use it if it feels good, or don't journal. I don't care. But I will say I'm a big fan of journaling in the style of morning pages, as created by Julia Cameron in The Artist's Way, which is like pick up a journal, write for 3 pages, just don't let your pen stop. Let whatever comes out comes out. It doesn't need to be deep. It doesn't need to be genius. It does not need to be a treatise on process theology or anything else. It can be petty, stupid, disjunct, um, funny. You can write about the day you want to have. Just let your brain, like, the way I thought about it is that, like, all of my real thoughts, the ones that are kind and loving and helpful, they're maybe not my real thoughts. My most helpful thoughts are below all my bullshit thoughts.
mm,
And in the morning, when I take time to connect with source, with myself, with love, I'm more likely to be in touch with that part of me than on days when I'm not. So that alone is reason to do it. Not because you'll find God, but because you'll find yourself.
mhm.
And I would say again, what's the difference?
The way you're describing these practices, it's really interesting. I grew up in the sports world, and obviously that meant like going to practice every single day.
Mm.
And I still remember picking up a football or a basketball or whatever in third grade, and realizing really quickly I'm not Michael Jordan and I'm not Tom Brady right away, right?
And I'm not Thich Nhat
And
Hanh, and I'm not the Buddha.
right. But then I realized there was a time and place when Michael Jordan picked up his first basketball and Tom Brady picked up his first football. And so they were at that, whether they were in first grade or whoever, who knows how old they were, but they picked up their first football and they were not the best football player or basketball player in the world right then and there, right?
Hmm.
They took years and years and years of practice. And now, obviously, they just had a lot of natural gifted talent, but they took years and years of practice where they worked really hard at this particular craft
Hmm.
and they got really good at it to the point where they're often regarded as the best in the world.
Hmm.
And I wonder how we should think through that in terms of spiritual practices. Not to say that everybody who ever does a spiritual practice needs to be the best person in the world, right? There's a lot of
Yeah.
people who pick up a basketball and they do it because they just like to, they enjoy it and they want to get as good as they can at it, but that
Hmm.
doesn't mean that they are trying to become the best in the world at it, right?
Right.
And so I'm kind of wondering, like, should we think of spiritual practices in that way? Of, the beauty of that is the fact that, like, we all start out at some point at the
Hmm.
same level,
Yes.
and some of us get really really good if we practice enough at it.
Hmm.
And so anyway, I'm,
And
I'm
also, some
curious
of
kind
us
of your
have
thoughts
so
around
many
that.
resistances to it specifically because, like everything, there's growing pains, there's a learning curve, there's uncomfortable bits, and especially for seated like stillness practices for meditation. Like when I say like spiritual practice, like doing quote unquote the work, which I really just think the work is learning how am I going to love myself no matter what, requires us to start actually loving ourselves, and to stop being assholes to ourselves.
Mm,
It's I'm talking like it really is like these things like we come up against our self hate, our pre-programmed self hate. They programmed it into us. We come close face to face with our own self-loathing. We come face to face with our own fat phobia. We come face to face with our own misogyny and patriarchy that we have built in, and it's so uncomfortable because we don't want it anymore. We don't want. I was like, I don't want to feel that. I don't want to feel that, and then the body's like, yeah, we'll let it go then.
mm,
We've been carrying this around for so long, and so like it's when we start off, it's just like we think again perfectionism. I got to be perfect, therefore, as my Father in heaven is perfect. Matthew 5:48. That was the one that was burned into me, and that's not what spirituality, good spiritual practice is. It's it's just like, do you want to feel better? Do you want to pick it up? Well, I did it yesterday, but then I didn't do it for a week. Okay, do you want to do it again now? Like,
mm,
it's here for you. If you don't want to, it's okay. Like, I'm not the kind of like, unlike a sports coach, you show up, you win. Like, I mean, like that. If you want to put it in terms of winning and losing, the only thing you're losing out on is peace, and the only thing you're gaining is peace. Like that's literally it. That's
mhm,
the winning and losing scenario here. Um, you're not good or bad. You're not better if you do. You might feel better if you do, but you're not better than somebody because you meditate. You're not like as like we look at someone Thich Nhat Hanh, who's like was the preeminent Zen Buddhist master of our generation or the last generation. But I don't think he didn't consider equality with Buddha something to be grasped, if you will.
right.
He wasn't trying to get to that point. He was trying to experience himself, trying to experience the love that was already present. Um, and that's another thing I think that we're trying to do is like, so if you start off with 5 minutes or like 1 minute, or you start off with 30 minutes and it feels good and then you don't do it again, okay, that's normal. You should start off with something smaller. Like, just think of it that way. Think of yourself like you're in training a little bit, like you said.
Mhm,
It's a little
mhm,
bit of both and I'm just like, but the end goal again, like winning, being the best simply just means I feel my best and I'm showing up as my full self in every single situation because I've practiced being myself and loving myself unconditionally. Like
mhm,
that's, and so it's like, yeah, you start off, you might not feel it the first day. You might not feel it the first week. And if you're not feeling it, that means that you need to find probably a different form of meditation because there's so many different techniques. Or maybe you just need to find a different practice. Maybe what I suggest isn't for you. That's the
mhm,
thing. I'm not for everybody, but I will say that the majority of people who practice these, nothing I'm saying or sharing is new either. That's the thing. This is shit that I have learned and has been time tested. So I'm like, it's everyone, everyone and their mom can tell you about the benefits of meditation. You don't need another book about that. What I wrote was just like, this is what it did for me. This is how it inspired me. This is how it's keeping me in the center of God. You know, that's what I'm the best at. I'm the best at having a relationship with God, between me and God,
mhm,
and managing that relationship with
mhm.
me and me.
So I'm pretty involved in a lot of, like, left movement stuff, protest, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
The socialist world. And there is generally a lot of suspicion about religion and spirituality from that world
Hmm.
for good reasons, with the way that
Yes.
conservative Christians, especially in America, have been over decades and hundreds of years. Certainly, I can understand why some of these left movements have suspicion of religion and spirituality. But I
Hmm.
will say, one of many reasons why we don't see a very, very strong left in at least America
Hmm.
is because a lot of that movement work is not sustainable without good spirituality.
Ooh, you can
And
say that.
uh,
Oh
can
man.
I get an amen? So I think that these spiritual practices, whether somebody is a Christian in the left world or not a Christian, an atheist, doesn't matter.
Hmm.
As we've talked about in this episode, does not matter. At the
Yes.
end of the day, I think these movements need good, intentional, communal, spiritual practices
Hmm.
in order for that work to be sustained,
Hmm.
for the good movement protest work that they're doing to be sustained.
Yes.
So, can you talk a little bit about how maybe in your own life you've seen spiritual practices cultivate work for justice in the world,
Hmm.
or maybe it's in your own life, maybe you've seen it in other kind of
Yeah.
movement protest groups. But I'm just curious around that
Yeah.
connection between the importance of spiritual practices and doing good justice work in the world.
I think that what you just said, the reason that so many of our own uh, work has been exhausting for us for so long, and why there's like, you see activist burnout, you see people who, give themselves to the movement, but they don't have anything that's giving back to them. It's that sacrifice model that my suffering does not matter. The collective liberation is what matters. If you do not see yourself as part of the collective liberation, you have no hope of bringing
Mm,
liberation to other people. If you don't think that you get to have the same kind of beautiful things that you're fighting for, love, joy, peace, patience, etc., dignity, rest. If you don't think that you deserve those things, how the hell are you going to give it to anybody else?
mm,
Um, and I really am convinced that one of the reasons that Martin Luther King was so successful was because of his spiritual underpinnings,
yes.
was because he was someone who was connected to source, and even him towards like, as his life progressed, I truly believe he would have become, had he not been assassinated, a central figure in kind of like the religious left.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Being in Atlanta, his church is still here, and so like there's a kind of like in some ways a tradition around um, religious organizing in some way. So especially around things like Cop City in Atlanta, there's a huge presence of religious folks, and especially I would say like even like Christian pastors, and there's even an interfaith justice coalition to stop Cop City, where we're all kind of like talking about like what are we going to do to take care of our people during this time? How
Mm-hmm.
can we help? Um, and because I think we're like, it's like if you want to see peace in the world, but you don't feel peace within yourself, you don't know how to welcome that. You don't know how to cultivate that. Um, if you want to talk about people forgiving one another, but you haven't forgiven yourself, what are you asking for? If you want to talk about justice, but you're not living justly,
Mm-hmm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing. And like this is what spirituality does, is it closes the gap between our perceived self that we want to be and who we actually are. And I'm not saying that this demands perfection. I think it demands honesty
Mm,
about who we are and what we need and how fragile we are. So within justice work, I think that this conversation that we're having here, like, we're, said another way, your emotional health matters. If you want to strip it of its esotericism, and or strip it of like it's the word spirit, the emotional health of our community matters. And there are things that we can do to help strengthen our resilience collectively. And it's through practice.
mm,
Again, like, again, strip all the esotericism away if you want to. Just go with the science of what science tells you about keeping a daily physical practice, and
mm-hmm.
do it for that reason.
Mhm.
Do, and like if you don't want to do it, oh, I don't want to feel good. I'm just like, do it because you want to be resilient enough to show up for your community. There are like, I could go on in 20 different directions like this,
Mhm.
but find a reason. But like the thing about it is like that's another reason I want people to like get this book and start diving into this stuff is because we're at I think an inflection point in American history that if we don't start figuring out how to take care of ourselves and like show up for the protests and show up for the elections and organize people to vote around the good stuff that we need. I mean, I don't want like I don't the American empire does not need to slip into fascism, and we are so close to it. And if
Mhm.
we don't find a way to take care of ourselves and with a full-throated, full-hearted say no to the bullshit that's coming, then it's going to take us.
Mhm.
Maybe not exactly, in our lifetime. Like people think, oh, it can't happen. It's gonna be far. No, no, no. It's here. It's now. And this is, frankly, I take this is serious business to me.
Mhm.
And so I like spirituality along with political organizing, along like it's what I think spirituality will also show you is that you do not have separate lives. It's not your church life and spiritual life over here and your sex life and your friendship life over here. When you're truly integrated, it's one life.
Mhm.
And that's a beautiful thing. And it is also a heavy thing sometimes. But I wouldn't have it the other way because the other way I was numb.
Mhm.
And on this side of things, while I'm experiencing definitely a lot more sorrow, the joys, the absolute freedom to be myself, nothing compares.
Mhm.
So
Love that.
I hope that answered that question. I feel like I went in a couple different directions.
No, absolutely. Um, Obviously, there's an endless number of spiritual practices, but
Hmm.
are there any spiritual practices that you personally have not started engaging in, but would
Mm.
like to someday?
Mm. That I haven't, that I want to. Um, I I think eventually I would like to study um I guess like more ceremonial, like ritual, like a little bit more like I want to study more cuanderismo, which is basically Mexican magic and medicine,
Mm.
which is the my heritage. And I'd like to learn a lot more about what those practices can do for me and also for my people. Um, but I haven't engaged with it because I've just been over here in yoga land for,
Mhm.
a good minute. And it seems to be something that's really, really powerful. Um, and I tend once I find something that works, I'm gonna ride it until until the wheels fall off. So that's,
Love that.
you know, thankfully, I don't think this wheel is one that can break.
I love that. Kevin, how do you hope this book inspires and liberates its readers?
I hope that the book, A Tiny Revolution, not A Tiny Revolution, that's my podcast.
Which you should
uh,
also check out, though.
you should also check out. It's super liberating. I hope that What Makes You Bloom gives people the framework to begin finally, to just start. The way I put it is like start small and mighty. Like just be
Mm.
so fucking dedicated to feeling good, to your own peace of mind, to your own heart. Um, so that nothing can stand in the way, not even your own doubts. I want you to be so in love with you that every piece of bullshit just melts away. That you get so in love with life itself that, you know, losing people, losing relationships, things shifting for you, you'll be able to deal with any suffering that comes your way, but also you'll be doing it because you're moving towards joy. And as you move towards joy, you'll find people who want to do it with you. And as you find those people are going to want to be able to like help change and shift things for you. Like, you know, said another way, revival. But not in the way you think, guys. I don't want you to get, I don't, I want you to get the actual Holy Ghost, I want you to meet Jesus so you can realize he's not the point. You are.
God, I love when
Isn't
you sound like a Christian.
it annoying?
It's one of my favorite parts of you,
Ugh.
especially when like the Southern Baptist preacher comes out of you.
Oh, hail. Oh,
That's my
shit.
favorite, Kevin.
He is, listen, he's in there. He want to tell you. And also, if he's not careful, he will cry on stage. Um but yeah, I really like when I like, not to harp on the word revival for a minute, but I was actually thinking about this the other day, but that's actually what I'm talking about, I think. And I don't mean like everyone's going to give their life to Jesus and like change their lifestyle so that they're boring. Um, I really do mean I want people to wake up and come alive. I want people to be in touch with God, and I want people, you know, to feel welcome to be whoever they are, and then like let that be the thing that changes us and moves us. If revival just means I'm gonna go get my feel goods in a tent to have somebody, hey, do you remember that God loves you? And said another way, do you remember that I love you? Do you remember that you love you?
Mm.
Do you remember that? Like that's another thing too. I'm just like, what if we stopped saying God loves you and we started saying I love you instead?
And God loves you too.
I don't know that, but I know that I love you. This is how sometimes I'm an atheist. you
But
know,
it's always the best when you're a Christian though too.
best.
It's
I'm everything. What? Who do you say that I am? That's what my friend said one time.
Kevin, last question. How can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where should they get the book?
Please go buy the book. It's called What Makes You Bloom? Cultivating not a spiritual practice, just cultivating a practice for connecting with your divine self. It's from Broadleaf Books. It's available everywhere fine books are sold on January 9th. And you can also purchase an autographed copy directly from me at thekevingarcia.com/bloom. Please allow a week or so for delivery because I'm slow as fuck on getting things out. But you will get it, and it does support me directly. You can follow me across the internet at the Kevin Garcia. My website is thekevingarcia.com. My podcast is called A Tiny Revolution. And if you're single and you want to take me on a date, I would love that. I mean, or even if you're not single and you want to take me on a date, I'd love that too. Because whatever. um,
You're a fun date.
I am a very, very fun date. I'm not gonna lie. I'm a treat to be having. What? I'm a treat to be having. That is
I mean,
whatever.
maybe later, and and at the end of the date, maybe you could be a treat that the person's
That is
having,
had.
right?
But yeah, follow me across the internet, the Kevin Garcia. Subscribe to the podcast. Get my book. The first book is called Bad Theology Kills. It's at badtheologykills.com. And also, please make sure that you rate this podcast, A People's Theology.
Yeah, thank
Please
you.
subscribe to Mason on YouTube. Give him a like and a thumbs up and a little bell notification. And share this because it really does help with getting this podcast and this conversation out into more ears. I always like to
Love
do
it.
that because sometimes podcast people don't like to do that.
That's right. Wow, thank you so much, Kevin.
Thank
Again, a
you.
great friend. So excited that this book is out in the world,
You're a good
and
friend,
can't wait
Mason.
for people to read it, and also not only be transformed by their spiritual practices, but also be transformed by how inspired they are by your story and your own spiritual
Mm,
practices. So thank you so much for sharing more about it.
thank you for having me, and thank you for always being such a wonderful support. You are a good friend as well, Mason.